November 12, 2022. It's only a few weeks away from Thanksgiving in Cleveland, Ohio.
In the city of Cleveland, a lot of people look forward to Thanksgiving because it reminds people of family. It gives us a chance to kind of huddle together and have kind of a respite from the day-to-day grinds of society.
The leaves are turning, people are getting prepared to have their meals, and there's just a sense of excitement in the air.
Cleveland resident Candy Moore is no exception. But on this chilly Saturday morning, as she's scrolling through social media, Candy sees a post that takes her breath away.
It's a Instagram post from the account Cleveland Remembrance page. It's kind of like a unofficial neighborhood news source.
The post mentions Candy's niece, 23-year-old Adriana Taylor.
Adriana Taylor is missing.
The post was from some friends that had given the page information that she'd been missing for quite some time.
But this is the first time Candy is hearing about Adriana's disappearance.
It had to be kind of shocking to find out from a social media post that your loved one is missing.
At the time that the aunt finally saw the information, her niece had been missing almost 30 days.
Concerned by what she's just read, Candy tries to contact Adriana, but her calls go straight to voicemail.
That alarmed her.
She thought something was going on that wasn't right.
Your mind is spiraling. You're trying to figure out exactly how this could ever happen to you or your family member and how to fix it as quickly as possible.
23-year-old Adriana Taylor grabbed attention wherever she went.
Her smile, her heart, she would talk to everybody, make everybody feel good. She was fun.
She was such a loving and supportive person to the people that were around her.
She was very generous. She would give you the shirt off her back.
Adriana's inner light was all the more remarkable given her upbringing.
She didn't have the easiest of lives.
The parents weren't really in the picture all that much. She bounced around from family and friends.
Adriana was one of 6 kids and pretty much was raised by her grandparents.
It's common for people who don't have that relationship or that bond with their parents to not be able to flourish, but Adriana was able to beat those odds.
She had been through some things, but had come out on top with a good heart and a good spirit.
As soon as she was able, Adriana joined the workforce.
She had a job at the distribution plant. She was a hard worker.
She was out here trying to make a better life for herself by making an honest living.
Adriana really was committed to living a life of stability and family because that was what she was missing and that's what she craved.
So when Adriana's coworker, 43-year-old Anthony Kennedy, began showing interest in her, she was intrigued.
Hey, Adriana.
Hey.
How was your weekend?
It was good. I just chilled. It was pretty nice.
She wanted somebody who would protect her, somebody who would provide for her, somebody who would love her.
Somebody like Anthony.
Anthony was a nice guy, quiet, reserved. He wore glasses. He seemed responsible.
He was actually her supervisor, but he was creative, he was intelligent, good with numbers, he was helpful.
He showed Adriana that he was interested in her, he pursued her.
So look, this may sound a little weird, but are you busy later?
No, I was just gonna go home. Why?
Would you like to go to dinner?
I would love that.
Anthony on paper, checked the boxes, being loving, being financially secure.
They had that chemistry and things just moved on from there.
Before they knew it, Adriana and Anthony were building a life together.
The relationship moved very quickly. They moved in, they fell in love.
He says, I love you. I want to make a life with you. You can see why she would have thought This is the perfect guy. Adriana's life was becoming something that she had longed for. Having a secure relationship that was going to last.
But now, just 2 weeks before the start of the holiday season, Adriana's aunt, Candy Moore, has come across an alarming social media post.
The post says that Adriana's missing.
She was concerned. She wanted answers about what had happened to Adriana.
This is Adriana's aunt.
Candy immediately reaches out to Adriana's friend, Michaela Knowles, who appears to have submitted the post to the Cleveland Remembrance page.
Why didn't you contact us sooner?
I don't know. I guess I just got nervous. I was blowing things out of proportion.
But Michaela says the last time she talked to Adriana on October 8th, something definitely seemed off.
While they were on the phone, she heard something disturbing.
She said that she sounded a little scared.
Is everything okay over there?
Gunshots were heard in the background, and the phone disconnected.
Adriana.
That was her last interaction, and no one has heard from her since.
After overcoming a difficult upbringing, 23-year-old Adriana Taylor had finally found her footing in life.
She had a good job. She had friends that cared about her.
She also found the man she wanted to share a future with, her coworker, 43-year-old Anthony Kennedy.
What she saw in Anthony was a maturity. Anthony filled that void that a less mature man of her age couldn't give her.
But now Adriana's aunt, Candy Moore, is panicking after discovering that her niece hasn't been seen in over a month.
The last time that anyone reportedly heard from Adriana, gunshots were heard in the background.
Adriana.
This is extremely concerning.
It's a wonder why the friend didn't come right out and report that. And a lot of times, people just don't want to get that deeply involved. They don't know if it's really something, if it's really nothing.
I am so sorry I didn't say anything sooner. I was just so scared.
Within the African American community, there is a distrust of our police force. And it makes it hard to trust that they're going to follow through, they're going to care.
Regardless, Adriana's aunt knows it's time to involve the authorities. So on November 13th, 2022, she contacts the Cleveland Police Department to report Adriana missing.
She loved Adriana and she wanted her found.
Thank you for coming in, ma'am. Now, it's our understanding the last contact anyone had with her was October, is that correct?
That's what I was told.
We kind of learned that there seemed to be a little bit of strain with the family, and not speaking on a regular basis didn't seem super unusual. She didn't have contact with her family or even friends every day.
Adriana's aunt tells the police that her niece has been living with a boyfriend, Anthony Kennedy.
She also tells them about Adriana's disturbing final phone call.
Her friend said that they were talking on the phone when she heard gunshots.
The first thing that popped in my head was, why weren't we told about this sooner?
Thank you very much.
The timeline is very disturbing. Adriana was last seen in October, but she wasn't declared officially missing until almost mid-November. What happened in that time frame?
We need to immediately jump on this investigation.
Police start by heading to the rental Adriana and Anthony shared on the west side of town.
They knocked on the door and no one answered. It didn't look like anyone was home.
Detectives call Anthony and leave a voicemail asking him to contact them as soon as possible. And while they wait to hear back, they put out an APB on Adriana's car, a white Ford sedan.
Upon finding out Adriana had a car registered to her, I immediately took steps to find out if the vehicle's been towed, if it's in the impound lot, if it was, seen anywhere on any law enforcement databases.
Police learned that Adriana's vehicle was last spotted by traffic cameras on October 12th, over a month earlier.
Which was just a few days after her friend had spoken with Adriana.
Adriana's vehicle was last seen traveling towards Pennsylvania.
Cleveland police issue an alert for law enforcement in and around western Pennsylvania to be on the lookout for Adriana's vehicle.
Our primary concern is, where is this car?
But even though Adriana's vehicle is still in the wind, her boyfriend, Anthony Kennedy, has finally resurfaced.
He agreed to come down to the police station for an interview.
Once Anthony gets interviewed by detectives, his story is that Adriana has moved out of his house a month ago or so.
She lived with you for a couple of months, but left about a month ago. Mm-hmm. So by the beginning of October? Beginning of October into September.
Anthony says that while he and Adriana were in love a few months earlier, that changed fast after she moved in with him.
Anthony told police that Adriana had a drug habit.
Anthony says he first heard gossip about Adriana's drug use at work, but he refused to believe it.
There's all these rumors, but I'm like, don't come to me in the room, because unless I physically see it, I don't know, right? Then I found little blue pills.
He noted that the drug was fentanyl, and we know that there's an opioid crisis in America.
And then she was staying with me, and it would disappear for a few days, stay 2 days, disappear for a day, stay 3 days, disappear for a week.
Anthony claimed that she couldn't keep her job because she couldn't hold it together with all of the substance abuse.
As her supervisor, Anthony says he was forced to fire her from her role at the distribution plant. And he soon put his foot down at home, too.
I told her, I said, you can't be here no more. You gotta leave. You're causing too much problems. You're doing drugs.
He ended the relationship.
Anthony!
He's kicked her out.
And he says he hasn't talked to her since.
I think I tried to call her. She didn't answer. I just went straight to voicemail.
However, Anthony tells detectives he's heard whispers about what Adriana's been up to since their breakup.
There's rumors around where, she's thinking what to do.
Anthony told police that Adriana had gotten back with an ex-boyfriend.
But Anthony's weary to give detectives the ex-boyfriend's name.
I don't want to end up dead. No, I don't want to end up dead either. I have a name, but I don't.
The reason for his anxiety soon becomes clear.
Anthony told police that Adriana used to date somebody who was a known drug dealer.
This wasn't some small-time street corner dealer. This was somebody who was moving weight.
A big name, a big drug name.
The type of man who could make a person disappear.
This is a dangerous man we're talking about.
They're goons, they're killers, they don't play.
"48 hours after 23-year-old Adriana Taylor was reported missing in Cleveland, Ohio, her co-worker turned boyfriend, Anthony Kennedy, has just given police their first lead.
Anthony told police that Adriana had started using drugs and that maybe she'd gotten back with an ex-boyfriend who was a drug dealer.
And I believe she's messing. I don't know if he's the kingpin or one of the bigger people there.
However, Anthony is hesitant to tell the investigators everything he knows.
Just hang tight. It's okay. All right? I don't want my life to be in danger. Okay. I don't want your life to be in danger either.
Ultimately, Anthony pushes through his fear to give the police a name, or at least a nickname.
Bear. Bear? Like the animal or the drink? Bear? Okay.
He mentions this male, goes by the name of Bear, alludes to the fact that he has something to do with her disappearance.
I feel like my life's in danger now. I really do. The temperature I just gave you, I feel like my life's in danger.
Anthony goes on to say he's heard rumors that Bear is expanding his drug operation.
The guy that she was with was actually trying to expand into Pennsylvania.
Could that explain why Adriana's car was last seen traveling in that direction?
There was a possibility that this was the reason that Adriana was going to that area because of her new relationship with Bear.
And if Bear is as dangerous a person as Anthony's saying, it's all the more reason police need to look into him.
It's not something that the police can overlook.
Police know drugs and violence go hand in hand. If something happened to Adriana, this could be the explanation.
But before the detectives can make much headway in locating Bear, a new lead emerges from yet another state, West Virginia.
Turns out Adriana's car was pulled over in West Virginia in October.
The traffic stop occurred on October 3rd, a week before surveillance cameras spotted the vehicle heading toward Pennsylvania, and just a few days before Adriana's alarming phone call with her friend, Michaela Knowles.
There were two people in the car. It's not known if the other passenger was Bear, but what is known is that there was possible drugs in the car.
The officer who pulled them over noted that the car had illegally tinted windows and was seen leaving a known trap house. However, no drugs were located in the vehicle at that time.
They were allowed to leave with just a citation for the tinted windows.
The information investigators are hearing seems to line up with what they've learned from Anthony Kennedy.
I told her, you're causing too much problems. You're doing drugs.
But where is Adriana now? And what about the man she was last seen with?
We followed up on these leads. We reached out to hospitals, some of the shelters, normal places where you would expect someone that maybe had OD'd or was looking for some kind of help would turn up, and we found no trace of that at all.
And it was like she just vanished.
At this point of the investigation, there now seems to be more questions than answers.
But then, detectives receive a promising phone call from their colleagues in Pennsylvania.
We received information from a small suburb of Pittsburgh that they had towed her car. It was just abandoned on the street in a no parking zone.
I don't know where the car was at exactly, but good amount of dirt on the tires.
Obviously, it's been sitting a while with these leaves and stuff.
Cleveland investigators think this could be the break they've been waiting for.
We got pretty excited when we found out that her car had been found. Now again, we have another tangible lead that we can follow.
However, when Cleveland detectives arrive in Pennsylvania to examine Adriana's vehicle themselves, their hopes soon turn to new fears.
They notified us that they found quite a bit of cleaning solution throughout the vehicle.
There were several spots of blood spatter.
The alarm bells rang.
On November 16th, 4 days into the search for 23-year-old Adriana Taylor, Cleveland detectives have learned that Adriana's missing sedan has been located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Pittsburgh police let them know, hey, this car's been abandoned here for a little bit. I think you guys should come and look at it.
We immediately made arrangements to travel to Pittsburgh, to the area where her vehicle was recovered.
And when detectives arrive to examine the vehicle, they make a troubling discovery.
We learned the car had been cleaned.
Someone had scrubbed the vehicle from top to bottom.
But that's not all.
There were several spots of blood spatter on both the inside and outside of the vehicle. And the blood was a match for Adriana Taylor.
It's evidence that points to a disturbing possibility.
It seems like there's foul play.
That kind of gave me more of an alarm bells, like something really might be wrong here.
With this chilling new evidence in tow, detectives start making rounds with residents on the street where Adriana's abandoned vehicle was found.
We were able to canvass the neighborhood.
They quickly turn up a promising witness.
And we're here because there was a car found in your alley.
Yeah,
You're familiar with this.
Yeah.
We
The man describes something suspicious he witnessed on the night of October 12th.
I saw the car pull up, okay. The guy got out of the car and he opened both back doors, took something out in a plastic bag and threw it in the dumpster that was back there. Then he checked the rest of the car around, didn't open the trunk. But he did check the rest of the car and then locked the doors and then walked that way.
Walked that way, okay. Yeah.
We learned from witnesses on scene that someone dropped off the car, cleaned it, and threw away some cleaning supplies in a dumpster.
Detectives search the dumpster for evidence, but they're out of luck.
The dumpster had already been emptied several times since the incident occurred. It was frustrating to miss out on whatever that evidence might have been.
Now more concerned than ever that Adriana's disappearance could involve foul play, investigators circle back to inform Adriana's Aunt Candy of what they've learned so far.
Adriana's loved ones were still hopeful that she would be found alive, but it was becoming harder to hold on to those hopes by the day.
It was devastating. You can't wrap your mind around it.
Hoping to verify the leads they've gotten from Anthony Kennedy, detectives inquire about Adriana's alleged drug use.
We did end up verifying that she was friends with some individuals that, did have a history of drug behavior.
But the people who know Adriana best insist she wasn't a part of that.
She didn't use drugs at all.
Maybe some pot here and there, but that was it.
Are you sure about that?
Absolutely.
We weren't really able to substantiate that she was ever into drugs.
Detectives also inquire about the man known as Bear, who Anthony pinned as Adriana's drug-dealing lover.
Okay, what about a guy named Bear? Do you know him?
Yeah, I knew him. He was a friend of hers.
A boyfriend, right?
No, just a friend.
From what we were getting from everyone, Bear was like a brother to Adriana.
Okay, do you know if he was dealing drugs?
Bear? No way.
Michaela laughed at the idea of Bear being involved in drug dealing. She said that's not the kind of guy that he was at all.
Which forces the investigators to rethink everything they've been led to believe.
Anthony told us Bear deals drugs, and he was kind of casting blame upon him.
They're goons, they're killers, they don't play.
Police are not sure what's going on, how truthful this is.
It set off suspicions. Well, what's really going on here?
With Michaela's help, police are finally able to track down Bear, who they identify as 25-year-old Jabari Williams.
Were you in a romantic relationship with Adriana?
Nah, nothing like that. I mean, we hung out sometimes.
He was, in fact, Adriana's friend.
It was just an amicable relationship between two adults.
And according to Jabari, he hasn't seen Adriana in months.
When was the last time you saw her?
Probably July, maybe August.
His phone records appear to support what he's telling the police.
Other than what Anthony had told us about Bear, there was really no link between Bear and Adriana around the time of her disappearance.
Now with Bear in the clear, all roads lead back to one man, Anthony Kennedy.
It just seemed like Anthony had created a scapegoat almost, and wanted us to believe it was Bear.
Hoping to learn more about Anthony's relationship with Adriana, detectives head to the distribution plant where they both worked.
Once the police start to have these conversations with Adriana's coworkers, they start to make connections that Adriana and Anthony's relationship was not as pleasant as they thought it was.
According to coworkers, the couple's relationship had been a source of trouble from the beginning.
Anthony had actually been written up at one point because of his relationship with Adriana. As her direct supervisor, he shouldn't have had any kind of, extracurricular relationship with her.
The 20-year age gap between them also made some of their colleagues uncomfortable.
The age difference was somewhat alarming.
What it says to me about Anthony is that he was looking for someone who he would be able to maybe manipulate or even control.
When detectives ask Adriana's coworkers about the circumstances under which she was fired, they realize Anthony has misled them once again.
Adriana was let go, but she was not let go, the distribution center said, because of drugs.
She was ultimately let go because of 2 no-call, no-shows.
Her firing happened in early October, around the same time she went missing.
That would mean that Anthony Kennedy's version of what happened seemed to be a lie.
In the weeks after Adriana disappeared, employees say that Anthony's behavior grew increasingly alarming.
Anthony told one of their co-workers that he had cameras installed in their home to be able to see what Adriana was doing.
He has almost like an obsession with her. He would watch her on his camera. He talked about her constantly.
Anthony's co-workers tell detectives that when a rumor began to spread in October of 2022, his obsession evolved into jealousy.
There was some rumors going around that there was a video out there of Adriana engaging in sexual activity with another man that worked at the distribution center.
What are you laughing at?
Nothing, man. Just a video we found online, dude. Chill.
It was never proven that this was true, but this was certainly something that Anthony himself heard.
We learned from coworkers of Anthony that he made some offhand comments that he's going to kill her because of this alleged infidelity in their relationship.
She's done!
What is his problem?
But as investigators dig deeper, they're shocked to discover Anthony was the one making moves behind closed doors.
Anthony was living a double life.
We learned that he was actually married.
Detectives investigating the disappearance of 23-year-old Adriana Taylor have just unearthed alarming new information about her 43-year-old boyfriend, Anthony Kennedy.
There was a rumor going around work that Anthony was jealous because he'd heard that Adriana had made a sex tape with someone else.
She's done!
What are you talking about?
Anthony was heard to have said that he was going to kill her.
It's really disturbing. It kind of makes you wonder, like, what is going through his head?
And as investigators dig deeper into Anthony's past, they learn that they've only scratched the surface.
Anthony was hiding a lot of secrets, but one of the biggest secrets he was hiding was that he was married. Anthony was living a double life. He was legally married to somebody else, but here he was, pursuing this younger woman at work.
When detectives contact Anthony's wife, Anastasia, she agrees to come into the station to speak with them.
Anastasia was shocked to find out that Anthony had been living with a woman in his apartment for 4 months.
I just can't believe this.
I'm so sorry, ma'am.
Anastasia tells detectives that she and Anthony were married in July of 2022, but even after exchanging vows, her husband insisted on keeping separate residences.
He was telling her that he has this lease that he can't break, and he has to stay here until it's over with.
When their leases were up, they were supposed to move in together.
Anastasia's work as a traveling nurse meant the couple spent long periods of time apart.
She had not seen Anthony in the whole month of October.
She had no idea that he was essentially living 2 lives. She was in complete disbelief. So he must have done a good job of keeping his 2 lives completely separate.
As far as the investigators are concerned, they've heard everything they need to know about Anthony Kennedy. Now, they just need to find him.
They move in for the arrest, but Anthony is on the run.
However, investigators secure a warrant to search the rental he once shared with Adriana.
Inside the apartment, it's packaged as if someone's moving, and we're immediately struck by the living room.
The carpet had been ripped up.
It was at that time that we all kind of got a sinking feeling and knew something bad had happened here.
Investigators find more concerning evidence in Anthony's backyard.
There's a giant burn mark in the rear of the driveway with what appears to be fabric within it.
Anthony had burned something large back there.
At this point, obviously, Anthony is suspect number one.
And the next day, he finally shows up at the Cleveland Police Department, ready to talk.
He wanted to kind of get this straightened out and take care of it.
Investigators start asking questions.
The carpeting being removed from the apartment. Why'd you do that? Because of bed bugs.
Anthony also attributes the burn marks in his driveway to bed bugs.
Where did you see the bed bugs at? I saw her on the couch because it bit me, and I see it was all in the lining of the couch. So you cut the couch up? I cut the couch up and burned it.
Our initial reaction was deception. Everything he said to us seemed to be deceptive. Short answers, kind of not making sense, talking in circles.
But as much as police suspect Anthony's involvement in Adriana's disappearance, they lack the physical evidence to prove it.
Things are still very circumstantial. There's actually not even a body. We, at this point, don't even know whether Adriana is dead or alive.
So as the Thanksgiving holiday approaches, the prime suspect in Adriana's disappearance remains a free man.
We've kind of come to a bit of a standstill on it. After the holidays, we're going to regroup, hit it hard again.
But on the night of November 24th, a stunning discovery immediately reignites the investigation.
Oh, shine that on there. That's a hand.
Oh, wow. Oh, my God.
2 weeks after 23-year-old Adriana Taylor was reported missing, the investigation into her disappearance has come to a standstill.
The police had suspected that Adriana's boyfriend, Anthony Kennedy, was behind her disappearance. However, they didn't have enough evidence to prove it.
But at 11 p.m. on the night before Thanksgiving, as Cleveland investigators lay sleeping, police 140 miles away in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, are responding to an alarming 911 call.
The landlord is calling the police because a suspicious male appears to be digging in his backyard, and he's watching the whole thing live on his cameras.
By the time police arrive, the mystery man has fled.
He was back here for an hour. We had him on camera. Dude that submitted.
That's weird.
Was immediately suspicious, and the landlord wants the spot dug into. He wants to know what he's doing back there.
Okay, let me try to get on that side and I'll try to lift it up.
Ultimately, the police kind of move the debris, fresh, wet concrete, underneath all of this.
Something's in there, man.
I hope it's not a dead body. Shine that on there. That's a hand.
Oh, wow. Oh, my God.
After radioing for backup, officers speak to the landlord's tenant, who had been living inside his rental property for several months.
They showed her the security video, and she instantly recognized the man on the tape.
So this guy's your relative?
He's my brother.
What's your brother's name?
Anthony Kennedy.
When news of these events reaches Cleveland, the detectives working Adriana's missing persons case are stunned.
I woke up Thanksgiving morning to about 100 missed calls, and come to find out that they had found Adriana's body in Pennsylvania. And there was Ring camera footage. I was in disbelief. Like, all of our jaws were on the floor. Like, it's very rare to discover a buried body, let alone capture the whole thing on 4K HD video.
An autopsy soon confirms just how Adriana died.
Adriana was killed with a single gunshot wound to the top of her head. From the angle, it appeared that she had to have been laying or sitting at the time she was shot.
Investigators believe Adriana was killed not long after she spoke to Michaela Knowles on the phone for the last time. And when they received video footage seized from Anthony's home security cameras, their suspicions are confirmed.
On the day that we're pretty sure Adriana is killed, Anthony comes home from work, distraught, rips down the camera, and at the same time, inside the home, you see Adriana wearing the exact clothing that she was found buried in.
Although what happened next wasn't caught on camera, investigators are confident they now know how Adriana died.
When Anthony takes that camera off, it really just tells us that he intends to do something bad.
Police believe that Adriana and Anthony got into a fight.
A fight over a videotape that didn't exist.
They started arguing over the supposed videotape of Adriana sleeping with another man.
How could you do this to me?
Anthony, you need to calm down. I didn't do anything to you, okay?
You a liar!
Lying about...
Everybody at work talking about
What are you talking about? Nobody said anything. Whatever it is, it might be a lie.
He thought that Adriana was cheating on him. He felt betrayed and angry.
Investigators believe that during a break in the argument, Adriana made a phone call to her friend, Michaela.
Well, what are you up to?
But Anthony wasn't done.
So you think you can just disrespect me, right?
Girl, just hold on. Give me 1 second.
Anthony was waving a gun around and began firing.
Calm down, Anthony, please!
However, police believe the gunshots Adriana's friend heard on the phone weren't the ones that killed her.
We believe that she was shot laying down on a couch, possibly even shot taking a nap, which is the reason for the couch being burned in Anthony's backyard.
It's completely premeditated. It's unfeeling. It's horrific.
After Adriana was dead, Anthony came up with a plan to hide her body in the backyard of his sister's rental home, 140 miles away in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
When he became a suspect in the investigation, he started to worry that he hadn't done a good enough job.
As police closed in on him, Anthony returned to his sister's rental the night before Thanksgiving to improve the burial. And thanks to the landlord's surveillance camera, it was all caught on tape.
Between the first burial and the second reburial, the landlord had actually signed up for a free trial to Ring. Unfortunately for Anthony, he picked the time to rebury the body right in the middle of that free trial. There's some kind of divine intervention.
Investigators are now confident they have the evidence they need to charge Anthony with Adriana's murder.
He's obviously dangerous, so it was our top priority to get him in custody. A lawyer reaches out to us and says that he's been retained by Anthony's family, and this lawyer negotiated his surrender.
Anthony eventually turns himself in and immediately starts talking about a plea deal.
Once he was in custody, it was a lot of conversation between lawyers, but he ended up taking a plea.
Despite Anthony's willingness to plead guilty, the court shows him little mercy.
The judge sentenced Anthony to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 23 years.
I think Anthony is where he belongs.
Fueled by rage and jealousy, Anthony Kennedy committed an act of unthinkable violence.
It seemed like Anthony really wanted to have it all. He wanted to be able to live his life in ways that he wanted to, while also controlling how other people live their lives.
And in his pursuit of power and control, he destroyed the life of a young woman whose future was full of promise.
She wanted to make something of herself. She was on her way.
This is a cautionary tale for everyone, especially young women. Be careful of who you select as your partner and do your due diligence. At the end of the day, it could save your life.
The night looked ordinary in Frederick, Colorado, the kind of quiet suburban darkness that wraps itself around houses like a familiar blanket. Streetlights hummed faintly over empty roads, and the wind moved slowly across rows of homes that all looked almost identical in the way they held their secrets behind closed doors. Inside one of those homes, at 2825 Saratoga Trail, a family of 4 slept under the illusion that tomorrow would be just another Monday. But in truth, something inside that house had already begun to fracture beyond repair, like glass cracking under invisible pressure. Christopher Watts stood at the edge of that life, not as a victim of circumstance, but as the person who would soon end it. On the surface, he was the kind of man neighbors barely noticed. He worked in the oil industry, wore baseball caps, smiled politely during driveway conversations, and never appeared to be anything other than calm and unremarkable. People often described him later as quiet, nice, even soft-spoken, as if those words could explain what they would soon learn he was capable of. Inside the house, his wife Shanann Watts was sleeping after returning from a business trip. She was 34 years old, pregnant with their 3rd child, and exhausted from travel. Her life was built around schedules, messages, responsibilities, and the constant effort of holding a family together that, from the outside, still looked whole. Her phone had been active all day during her trip, full of updates, photos, and conversations that painted a picture of someone deeply engaged in the rhythm of motherhood and partnership. But what she did not fully see, or perhaps did not want to see, was how far the distance had grown between her and the man she trusted most. That distance had been growing quietly for months. It was not a sudden collapse, but a slow erosion of intimacy, trust, and shared purpose. Financial pressure weighed heavily on them. Arguments had become more frequent, though often hidden behind brief reconciliations and attempts to return to normalcy. And beneath it all, there was something Shanann did not yet fully know. Christopher Watts had begun an affair with a co-worker, a relationship that opened a door in his mind that should have remained closed. On the night of August 12, 2018, that hidden life collided with the one he had built at home. Shanann returned in the early hours of August 13, landing after her flight and being driven home by a friend. She texted Christopher during the ride, sharing small updates about her arrival. His replies were short, almost detached. There was nothing in those messages that would suggest what was about to happen, and yet everything about them now feels like silence before a storm. When Shanann walked through the front door of her house that night, she entered a space that no longer belonged to the version of her marriage she believed in. Christopher was awake. The children were asleep upstairs. The air between them, according to later accounts and confessions, was heavy with unresolved tension. This was not the first argument they had, but it would be the last. What exactly was said in those final hours is known only through fragments, confessions, and reconstructed timelines. But what is clear is that the conversation turned toward the collapse of their relationship. Shanann, pregnant and tired, confronted the reality of a marriage that was breaking apart. Christopher, already emotionally detached and entangled in another relationship, stood at a crossroads he would later describe in his own words as feeling like a door that had to be opened, no matter what was on the other side. At some point in the early morning hours, the argument escalated beyond words. The house, which had been filled with the quiet sounds of sleeping children and distant appliances, became the stage for tragedy that would erase an entire family line in a matter of minutes. In his later confession, Christopher Watts described what happened next in a flat, almost mechanical tone, as if he were recounting something that had happened to someone else rather than something he had done with his own hands. Shanann Watts never left that house alive. In the upstairs bedroom, where she had gone to rest after her flight, her life ended at the hands of her husband. The details of the act are deeply disturbing, not because they are sensational, but because of how ordinary the setting was. A bedroom that once held laughter, arguments, shared sleep, and the routines of married life became the place where that life was extinguished. There were no witnesses, no intervention, only the silence of a home that continued to exist even as everything inside it changed forever. Afterward, Christopher moved through the house in a state that investigators would later describe as disturbingly controlled. There was no immediate call for help, no visible breakdown, no attempt to wake neighbors or seek assistance. Instead, there was action, planning, and concealment. The children, Bella and Celeste, were still alive at that time, sleeping in their rooms unaware of what had just occurred downstairs. What happened next transformed the crime from a single act of violence into something even more devastating. According to his eventual confession, Christopher Watts took the lives of his two daughters shortly after. Bella, 4 years old, and Celeste, just 3, were killed in the same home where they had watched cartoons, played with toys, and called him Daddy without hesitation or fear. The method, as later described in court documents and interviews, was suffocation. There were no signs that the children understood what was happening in their final moments, a detail that investigators would never forget. By the time dawn approached, the house at Saratoga Trail was no longer a home in any meaningful sense. It had become a crime scene that had not yet been discovered, a space filled with absence rather than presence. But instead of revealing what had happened, Christopher Watts began constructing something else entirely, a story designed to delay the truth. When Shannan's friends began to notice her missing presence in group messages, concern quickly grew. She was not someone who disappeared without explanation. She was active, communicative, and deeply connected to her social circle. When texts went unanswered and calls failed to connect, unease turned into alarm. One of her friends eventually went to the house and rang the doorbell, setting in motion the first real contact between the outside world and the silence inside. Christopher answered the door with a calmness that, in hindsight, would become one of the most chilling aspects of the entire case. He appeared cooperative, even concerned. He spoke of not knowing where Shannan had gone, suggesting confusion rather than certainty. He allowed people into the house. He participated in early conversations with police. And at every step, he presented himself as a man trying to understand a disappearance rather than someone who had caused it. But even in those early hours, something did not align. Investigators would later point to inconsistencies in his behavior, small fractures in the narrative he was constructing. His emotional responses seemed measured rather than chaotic. His explanations lacked depth. And most importantly, the physical reality of the home did not support the story he was telling. As the sun rose over Frederick, Colorado, the Watts household was already becoming the center of a missing persons investigation that would soon transform into something far darker. Officers began arriving. Questions began multiplying. And somewhere within that house, behind closed doors and carefully maintained calm, the truth was waiting to be uncovered. At that moment, however, no one yet knew how far the deception extended. No one yet understood that this was not a disappearance waiting to be solved, but a carefully constructed illusion designed to delay the inevitable discovery of something far more horrific than anyone had initially imagined. Frederick, Colorado, is the kind of place that looks like it was designed to reassure people that nothing bad could ever happen there. Wide suburban streets stretch between neatly arranged houses, each one sitting behind a trimmed lawn and a 2-car garage. The mountains rise in the distance like a painted backdrop, always visible, but never intrusive, as if even nature agreed to stay calm here. It is a town built on routines, morning commutes, school drop-offs, evening barbecues, and the soft hum of air conditioning units working through long summer afternoons. On the surface, it is stability made physical. The Watts family home, at 2825 Saratoga Trail, fit perfectly into that landscape. It was a modern house, part of a newer development where every property seemed slightly too perfect, too uniform, like copies of the same idea of success. The house had clean lines, large windows, and rooms designed more for presentation than for chaos. To anyone passing by, it would have looked like a place where a family was building something solid, a future, a legacy, a life that made sense. Inside that structure, however, life was far more complicated. Christopher Watts and Sharnan Watts had built their marriage in the space between ambition and pressure. Sharnan was driven, energetic, and deeply committed to creating a life that reflected stability and success. She worked in sales, but more than that, she built her identity around communication, connection, and constant engagement with others. Her phone was rarely silent. Her days were filled with messages, updates, encouragements, and business conversations that blurred the line between personal life and professional identity. She was heavily involved in multi-level marketing, promoting a wellness product line called Thrive. To her, it represented opportunity, structure, and the possibility of financial freedom. She shared her journey publicly, posting videos and photos that showed transformation stories, motivational captions, and moments of family life that were carefully framed to reflect positivity. To outsiders, it looked like confidence and success. To those closer to her, it was also a constant effort to maintain momentum in a life that carried increasing financial strain beneath the surface. Christopher, in contrast, existed in a quieter register. He was not expressive in the same way. He did not appear in many of the videos Sharnan posted, and when he did, his presence often felt subdued, almost passive. He worked long hours in the oil fields, a physically demanding job that took him away from home for extended periods. In photographs, he often stood slightly apart from his family, smiling without intensity, as if participating in a scene rather than inhabiting it fully. Their relationship, by 2018, had become a system under pressure. Financial stress was one of the most significant strains. Despite appearances of stability, they were dealing with debt, missed payments, and the consequences of maintaining a lifestyle that required more income than they comfortably had. Conversations about money often turned into arguments, and arguments often ended in temporary silence rather than resolution. It was not a sudden collapse, but a slow accumulation of unresolved tension. Yet from the outside, the image remained carefully intact. Social media played a powerful role in that illusion. Sharnan documented milestones, family moments, and daily routines in a way that created a narrative of happiness. Birthday parties, holiday celebrations, and casual home videos formed a digital archive of what appeared to be a loving and functional household. Friends and followers saw a family that laughed together, traveled together, and built memories in real time. What they did not see were the gaps between those moments. The quiet nights when conversations were minimal. The growing emotional distance between husband and wife. The subtle changes in tone, attention, and presence that rarely appear in photographs. Like many modern families, the Watts family lived in two parallel realities, the one captured on screen and the one experienced behind closed doors. Christopher's emotional world during this period was increasingly shaped by separation. Not only separation from his wife, but also from the identity of the family man he had once been. In the months leading up to August 2018, he began a relationship with a co-worker, a connection that would later become central to understanding his state of mind. This relationship existed in secrecy, but secrecy has a way of altering perception. It creates an alternate version of reality where consequences feel distant and decisions feel reversible. As that relationship developed, the emotional structure of his home life began to shift. The contrast between the two worlds became more pronounced. One represented obligation, history, and responsibility, the other represented novelty, escape, and emotional detachment from existing commitments. In psychological terms, these dual realities rarely coexist peacefully for long. One eventually begins to overwrite the other. Sharnan, meanwhile, was preparing for the arrival of their third child, a son she was excited to welcome into the family. Pregnancy added both emotional intensity and physical vulnerability to her life during this period. She continued to travel for work, manage household responsibilities, and maintain communication with clients and friends. Her messages from this time reflect a person trying to hold multiple roles together at once: mother, wife, businesswoman, and friend. Despite the strain, there were still moments that appeared ordinary, even affectionate. Family photographs show smiles, vacations, and shared experiences that suggest continuity. This is what makes the Watts family case so unsettling in hindsight. There is no visible breaking point captured in a single moment. Instead, there is a gradual thinning of emotional connection that only becomes obvious after the outcome is already known. The house itself became a silent witness to this erosion. Rooms that were designed for family life slowly became spaces of separation. The master bedroom, once a place of shared rest, became a place of emotional distance. The children's rooms, filled with toys and color, remained emotionally untouched by the tensions unfolding between adults, preserving innocence in a way that makes what later happened to them even more difficult to comprehend. Neighbors in the community saw the Watts family as typical. There were no obvious signs of crisis visible from the outside. Lawns were maintained, routines were followed, and interactions remained polite. This normalcy is an important part of understanding the setting, because it reinforces how invisible internal collapse can be when external appearance remains controlled. By early August 2018, the family's life had entered a final phase of quiet instability. Shannan's business trips continued. Christopher's emotional withdrawal deepened. Communication between them became increasingly transactional, focused more on logistics than connection. Even arguments, when they occurred, seemed to lack resolution, as if both participants were moving through a script they no longer fully believed in. Yet nothing in the environment around them signaled that an irreversible point was approaching. The neighborhood remained unchanged. The house remained intact. The routines of suburban life continued uninterrupted. Children played, people commuted, evenings arrived and left with predictable calm. This is what makes the setting so critical to understanding what follows. The Watts family did not exist in a space of chaos or obvious dysfunction. They existed in a space of controlled appearance, where instability was managed rather than expressed. And in such environments, breakdown does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it builds quietly, behind closed doors, in the gaps between what is shown and what is felt. In the days before August 13, 2018, all of these elements were already in motion. Financial pressure, emotional detachment, secrecy, and the weight of unspoken dissatisfaction were converging inside a single household. Nothing had yet happened that would draw outside attention. No emergency had yet been declared. But the conditions for catastrophe were already fully formed, waiting only for the moment when control would finally give way to action. Before any crime is understood through evidence, timelines, or confessions, it must first be understood through people. In the case of the Watts family, the center of gravity is not the act itself, but the lives that were interrupted by it. Shannan Watts, Bella Watts, and Celeste Watts were not symbols, statistics, or supporting characters in someone else's story. They were individuals with daily routines, habits, emotions, and the small, ordinary rhythms that make a family feel alive long before it becomes a headline. Shannan Watts was 34 years old, but those who knew her often described her as someone who lived at full speed regardless of age. She communicated constantly, not out of superficiality, but out of a deep need to stay connected. Her phone was an extension of her presence in the world. Through it, she managed friendships, business relationships, family coordination, and her own emotional expression. Messages were never just messages for her. They were threads that held her life together. She grew up with a sense of resilience that shaped how she approached adulthood. Life had not been effortless for her, and that history seemed to fuel her determination to create stability later on. When she became a mother, that role became central to her identity in a way that was visible to everyone around her. She organized her days around her children's needs, their schedules, their emotions, and their growth. Even in moments of stress, she projected energy outward, as if movement itself could prevent collapse. Those who observed her from the outside often saw confidence. She posted frequently on social media, sharing moments that highlighted family life, personal progress, and emotional encouragement. But behind that curated visibility was a person carrying significant pressure. Financial strain was a constant undercurrent. Managing a household, a business-oriented side career, and family responsibilities required constant effort. There was little room for pause. Even rest often felt scheduled rather than spontaneous. Yet Shanann was not only defined by pressure. She was also deeply affectionate toward her children. Her relationship with Bella and Celeste was visible in small, consistent ways. She spoke to them with familiarity, affection, and a kind of structured patience that comes from a parent who is always balancing time. She documented their lives not just for others, but also for herself, as if preserving moments might help stabilize them. Bella Watts, the older of the two daughters, was 4 years old at the time of her death. She existed at a stage of childhood where imagination and reality blend seamlessly. She was described as sensitive, observant, and emotionally expressive. In family videos, she often appeared cautious in unfamiliar situations, sometimes watching more than she participated, as if carefully processing the world before stepping into it. Her attachment to her mother was visible in the way she stayed close during interactions, often seeking reassurance through proximity. There is something profoundly ordinary about a 4-year-old child that makes their absence feel incomprehensible in hindsight. Bella's life was built around small rituals, meals at specific times, bedtime routines, toys arranged in familiar patterns, and the constant presence of her younger sister. She was learning language, learning boundaries, learning how to exist in a world that was still entirely new to her. Every day was incremental growth, the kind that adults often overlook until it is gone. Celeste, often called CECE, was only 3 years old. She was more physically expressive than her older sister, more impulsive, and often described as energetic. She moved through spaces with less hesitation, drawn toward interaction and attention. In videos, she can be seen laughing easily, reacting quickly, and engaging with her surroundings in a way that reflects early childhood confidence. Her presence was often louder, more immediate, filling rooms with motion and sound. Between the two sisters, there was a natural dynamic of closeness and dependence. Bella and Celeste shared a bond that is common in siblings so close in age. They played together, followed each other, and mirrored each other's behaviors. Their relationship was not yet shaped by long-term rivalry or separation. Instead, it existed in a space of shared discovery, where everything was experienced side by side. Shanann often documented their interactions, capturing moments that would otherwise have been lost to memory. These recordings show ordinary domestic scenes, children playing in living rooms, responding to their mother's voice, reacting to small surprises in their environment. In those moments, there is no sense of impending tragedy. There is only the simplicity of family life unfolding in real time. What makes these lives so important to understand is not their exceptionality, but their normalcy. The Watts family was not outwardly marked by instability in a way that would have been obvious to casual observers. There were no visible signs that would have clearly signaled danger. Instead, there was the familiar complexity of modern family life, financial pressure, emotional fatigue, and the constant effort required to maintain balance between personal identity and shared responsibility. Shanann's role as a mother was deeply intertwined with her role as a partner. Like many parents, she carried the mental load of organizing daily life. Appointments, meals, emotional support, communication with schools, and household management often converged in her responsibility. This constant engagement created a life that was always in motion, rarely static, rarely paused. Christopher's relationship with the children was different in texture. In photographs and videos, he appears present but less central. His interactions are often gentle, sometimes playful, but not as consistently documented or emotionally foregrounded as Shannon's. This difference is not unusual in many households, but in hindsight, it contributes to the emotional contrast that later becomes significant. The home they lived in functioned as both a physical structure and a stage for these daily interactions. It contained laughter, routines, disagreements, and moments of calm. Kitchens where meals were prepared, bedrooms where children slept, living rooms where families gathered briefly before dispersing into separate activities. Each space held layers of repeated behavior, creating a sense of continuity that can make disruption feel even more abrupt when it occurs. Outside the family, friends and acquaintances saw Shannon as active and engaged. She maintained communication with a wide network of people. She was often described as someone who reached out, checked in, and maintained contact. This outward engagement created a perception of openness, a life lived in connection with others rather than isolation. Bella and Celeste, meanwhile, existed mostly within the private sphere of family life. Their world was not yet shaped by school environments, or extended social systems in a way that would later expand their independence. Their identity was still largely defined through their parents, particularly their mother, who documented and guided much of their early development. Understanding these victims means understanding not just who they were individually, but how they functioned as a unit. They were a family bound together by routine, affection, and shared dependency. Even in moments of tension between adults, the children remained the emotional center of the household. Their presence shaped daily decisions, schedules, and priorities in ways that are common in families with young children. And yet, beneath this visible structure, there was a fragility that was not immediately apparent. Financial strain created stress that was not always openly discussed. Emotional distance between adults created gaps in communication that were often filled with assumption rather than clarity. The children, by nature of their age, were unaware of these complexities. Their experience of the world remained simple, immediate, and rooted in trust. That trust is what gives their story its emotional weight. Not because they were unique in a public sense, but because they represented the most vulnerable form of human existence, children who depend entirely on the stability of the adults around them. In any family system, that dependency is absolute. It does not question the intentions of caregivers. It does not anticipate betrayal. It simply exists. On the surface, the Watts family appeared like many others navigating modern life. A working father, a mother balancing business and household demands, and 2 young children growing within that environment. There was nothing externally extraordinary about their daily existence. And yet, within that ordinariness, something was already beginning to unravel in ways that no one outside the household could yet see. To understand what happened later, it is necessary to hold on to this image of them not as victims defined by their deaths, but as people defined by their lives. Shannon, Bella, and Celeste existed in moments of laughter, routine, frustration, affection, and everyday normality. They existed in a world that, until a specific point in time, still believed in its own continuity. The night of August 13, 2018, did not announce itself as anything unusual. There were no storms rolling in over Frederick, no sudden disruptions in the quiet rhythm of suburban life, no external force that would have suggested that something irreversible was about to occur inside one of its ordinary homes. From the outside, it was a night like countless others in Colorado summer, warm air lingering over streets that were already half asleep, the hum of distant traffic fading into the background of residential silence. Inside the Watts household, however, time was no longer moving in a normal direction. It had become compressed, distorted, shaped by decisions that were unfolding behind closed doors. What happened in that house was not the result of a single moment, but the culmination of emotional pressure, secrecy, and confrontation that had been building long before that night began. The final hours of Sharnan Watts' life were not marked by spectacle or chaos visible to the outside world. They were contained within the walls of a home that still appeared, to anyone looking from the street, completely intact. Sharnan had returned home in the early hours after a delayed flight, arriving exhausted from her business trip. Her body was physically tired, her mind likely still partially occupied with the logistics of travel, family, and the transition back into domestic life. She had texted during her journey, maintaining the same pattern of communication that defined her daily existence. Nothing in those messages suggested urgency beyond the ordinary frustrations of travel. She was coming home. That was all. Christopher Watts was already there. What happened when she walked through the door is known only through fragments reconstructed later through confession and investigation. There were no witnesses, no external recordings, no interruption from the outside world. The house itself absorbed everything that occurred within it. At some point after her return, a confrontation took place between husband and wife. It was not an isolated disagreement, but the continuation of tensions that had been accumulating for months, tensions rooted in financial pressure, emotional distance, and the hidden reality of Christopher's extramarital relationship. In that early morning darkness, the house was divided into two zones of experience. Upstairs, children slept in their rooms, unaware of the conversation unfolding below. Downstairs, two adults faced the full weight of a relationship that had reached a breaking point. The details of their exchange are not fully preserved, but the outcome is undisputed. What began as words eventually crossed into irreversible action. The transition from argument to violence did not happen in a way that can be easily explained or summarized. There was no external escalation that drew attention from neighbors, no visible disturbance that broke the quiet of the street. Instead, there was a shift inside the private space of the home, a moment where control over the situation was replaced by something far more final. Sharnan Watts was killed inside that house. The setting in which this occurred makes the event even more difficult to comprehend. There was nothing in the environment that suggested danger in a traditional sense. The bedroom where she had gone to rest was familiar, domestic, and ordinary. It was a space associated with sleep, privacy, and routine. That contrast between function and outcome is part of what gives the case its enduring emotional weight. After her death, there was no immediate public acknowledgement of what had occurred. Instead, the house remained occupied by silence and motion controlled by a single person. Christopher Watts did not leave the home, or alert authorities at that moment. Instead, he moved through the space, making decisions that would later be analyzed in detail by investigators trying to reconstruct his actions minute by minute. Upstairs, Bella and Celeste were still alive during the initial phase of this sequence. They were asleep in their rooms, part of a household rhythm that had not yet been interrupted in their experience. The innocence of that moment is defined not only by their age, but by their complete separation from the reality unfolding elsewhere in the house. They were children in the most absolute sense, existing within a world structured entirely by trust and dependency. At some point after the killing of Sharnan, Christopher entered their rooms. The transition from one act to another marks a shift in the nature of the crime, moving from confrontation between adults to the destruction of an entire family unit. The details of what followed are known through his later confession, but even that account carries the limitations of memory filtered through legal consequence and psychological detachment. Bella and Celeste were killed inside the same home where they had lived their entire short lives. There is something profoundly disorienting about the absence of external disruption in this sequence of events. No emergency call was made during the critical moments. No neighbor reported sounds that clearly indicated what was happening. The house contained everything within itself, as if it had been sealed off from the rest of the world during the time it took for these actions to occur. After the deaths, the physical environment of the house did not immediately change in a way that would signal what had happened inside. The structure remained intact. Objects remained in place. The appearance of normality was preserved, not because nothing had occurred, but because nothing had yet been revealed. This separation between reality and perception is one of the most important aspects of the case, because it shows how violence can exist completely hidden within ordinary spaces. The morning that followed did not begin with disclosure, but with continuation. Christopher Watts began to construct an alternative narrative, one designed to replace the reality of the night with the idea of disappearance. This transition from private action to public deception is a critical turning point in understanding the full scope of what occurred. He would later present himself as someone searching for his missing family, expressing confusion and concern in interactions with friends and authorities. But at this stage, those performances had not yet fully begun. What existed first was the aftermath inside the home, a space that now contained absence in its most literal form, though that absence had not yet been externally recognized. The contrast between the interior reality of the house and the exterior perception of it creates a psychological tension that defines the early phase of the investigation. To the outside world, there was still a family that needed to be found. Inside the house, that family no longer existed in the same way. The truth was complete, but it had not yet been discovered. As morning light began to spread across Frederick, Colorado, the Watts home stood unchanged in appearance. Cars were still in the driveway. Curtains remained closed or partially drawn. From a distance, there was nothing to distinguish this house from any other in the neighborhood. Life around it continued in its usual pattern, unaware that within its walls, an entire family had already been erased. This disconnect between appearance and reality is what makes the early hours of the case so significant. Before investigators arrive, before questions are asked, before inconsistencies are identified, there is a period where the world outside still believes in a version of events that no longer exists. It is a fragile space, suspended between truth and illusion, and in the Watts case, that space would not last long. By the time concern began to spread among Shannan's friends and family, the narrative inside the house had already shifted into something constructed rather than lived. Messages went unanswered. Calls were not returned. The absence that began as silence quickly transformed into worry. That worry would eventually bring people to the front door of a house that still looked, from the outside, entirely ordinary. The significance of the crime lies not only in what happened, but in how completely it was initially concealed within a normal environment. There were no external signs that could have easily explained the reality hidden inside. The house did not scream what had occurred. It waited, silent and unchanged, for the moment when the truth would finally break through the surface. And when that moment came, it would not only reveal what had happened during those final hours, but also force an entire community to reconsider how easily the appearance of normal life can conceal something far more devastating beneath it. The first crack in the illusion did not come from a confession or a police siren. It came from silence. In the hours after Shannan Watts stopped responding to messages, the absence was not immediately interpreted as danger. In modern life, silence is often ambiguous. Phones die, meetings run long, sleep interrupts communication. But as time stretched forward on August 13, 2018, that silence began to change its meaning. It stopped feeling ordinary and started feeling wrong. Shannan was not someone who disappeared from conversation without reason. Her presence in the lives of others was active and consistent. Friends described her as responsive, engaged, and emotionally available even when she was busy. When messages remained unread and calls went unanswered, the pattern broke in a way that people close to her immediately noticed. At first, there was patience. Then concern. Then a growing sense that something did not align with who she was. By the afternoon, concern had turned into action. One of her closest friends, unable to reach her, made the decision to go to the house at Saratoga Trail. This was not yet a formal investigation, not yet a police matter in the traditional sense. It was a personal response, driven by intuition and the emotional logic that people who know each other well often rely on when official explanations are not yet available. When she arrived, the neighborhood still looked unchanged. The street was quiet. The houses around remained in their usual state of suburban stillness. Nothing about the exterior of the Watts home suggested urgency. There were no visible signs of disturbance, no broken windows, no evidence of struggle that could be seen from the street. The house looked like it always had, carefully maintained, visually normal, structurally intact. But normality can be deceptive when it is no longer supported by reality inside. The friend approached the front door and knocked. There was no immediate response. After a moment, the door was answered by Christopher Watts. What she saw in that interaction would later become part of the investigative record, not because it revealed everything, but because of what it failed to reveal. He did not appear visibly panicked. He did not display the kind of emotional collapse that might be expected in a man whose wife and children were missing under unknown circumstances. Instead, his demeanor was controlled, measured, almost calm. He spoke in terms of uncertainty. He said he did not know where Shanann was. He suggested confusion rather than clarity, concern rather than knowledge. The language he used placed him in the position of participant in a mystery rather than origin of it. This framing is important, because it shaped the first external understanding of the situation. At that moment, there was still no confirmed crime, only absence. The friend entered the house briefly. Inside, the environment did not immediately reveal signs of violence. There were no obvious indications that something catastrophic had occurred. The interior spaces still carried the appearance of a lived-in home. Objects were in place. Rooms were intact. Nothing about the visual field alone provided immediate answers. This is one of the most unsettling aspects of the early discovery phase. Crime scenes are often imagined as spaces of visible chaos, but many of the most serious cases begin in environments that appear undisturbed. The absence of obvious disruption delays recognition. It forces interpretation rather than immediate conclusion. As concern deepened, additional friends and acquaintances became involved. Messages circulated quickly through personal networks. Shanann's absence was discussed in group chats, phone calls, and private conversations. Each new hour without contact added weight to the suspicion that something was wrong. What began as personal concern was gradually transforming into collective awareness. Eventually, the situation escalated to the point where law enforcement was contacted. Officers were dispatched to conduct a welfare check at the residence. This marked the transition from private concern to official involvement. The house at Saratoga Trail was no longer just a family home, it had become a location under observation. When police arrived, they were entering a situation that was still undefined. At that moment, there was no confirmed classification of the case as criminal. It was treated initially as a missing persons investigation. That distinction matters, because it shapes the early approach to evidence, questioning, and interpretation of behavior. Christopher Watts interacted with officers in a manner that would later be heavily scrutinized. He appeared cooperative. He answered questions. He repeated his claim that he did not know where his wife and children were. His emotional presentation remained controlled. There was no visible breakdown that aligned with the severity of the situation, as it was being described. Inside the house, officers began observing the environment more closely. They noted details that, while not immediately conclusive on their own, contributed to a growing sense of inconsistency. Personal belongings were present. There were no obvious signs of forced entry. The home did not appear to have been externally violated. Yet the absence of 3 people from such a controlled environment raised immediate questions. One of the most important elements in early investigation is behavioral analysis. Officers pay attention not only to physical evidence, but also to how individuals respond under questioning. In this case, Christopher's responses were noted as calm, sometimes even detached. He did not exhibit the level of emotional distress that would typically accompany a sudden and unexplained disappearance of an entire family. At the same time, investigators were aware that emotional expression alone is not proof of guilt or innocence. People react differently to crisis. Some become hysterical, others shut down, and some maintain composure under pressure. But when combined with other inconsistencies, behavior becomes one piece of a larger puzzle. As the initial welfare check continued, officers began to gather more background information. They learned about Shannan's pregnancy, her active communication patterns, and her scheduled commitments. They also began to understand the structure of the household, including the presence of 2 young children who were also missing. The absence of the children significantly escalated the seriousness of the situation. A missing adult can sometimes be explained by voluntary departure or unforeseen circumstances, but the simultaneous disappearance of young children changes the investigative priority immediately. It introduces urgency and narrows the range of plausible explanations. Within hours, the case was no longer being treated as a simple missing persons report. It was becoming something far more complex, even if the full scope was not yet understood. Investigators began to expand their inquiry beyond the immediate physical space of the home, considering communication records, digital activity, and personal relationships. Christopher Watts remained at the center of all early interactions. He was the last known person to have seen Shannan and the children. That fact alone placed him in a position of primary interest, even before any evidence of wrongdoing had been established. In investigations of this nature, proximity to the victims is often the first critical factor in narrowing focus. As the day progressed, inconsistencies began to accumulate. Timelines did not align perfectly. Emotional responses did not fully match expected patterns. Small details in conversation and behavior created gaps that investigators would later revisit repeatedly. None of these elements alone confirmed anything, but together they began to form a pattern of uncertainty. Outside the house, the community was beginning to react. News of the missing family spread quickly through neighborhood networks and social media. People who had once seen the Watts family as ordinary neighbors were now confronted with the reality that something serious had occurred behind closed doors. Concern turned into speculation, and speculation turned into attention from a wider public. Inside the house, however, the physical environment remained unchanged. That contrast between external escalation and internal stillness created a psychological tension that defined the early stage of the case. The world outside was moving toward urgency, while the space inside still held the appearance of normal life. By the end of this initial phase of discovery, the situation had shifted permanently. What began as unanswered messages had become a formal investigation into the disappearance of a mother and 2 children. The house that had once been a private family residence was now a focal point of investigative scrutiny. But at this stage, one critical truth remained hidden. The explanation for their absence had not yet been uncovered. The surface of the case still held its ambiguity, and beneath that ambiguity lay a reality that would soon change everything investigators thought they understood about what had happened inside that house. As the initial shock of the disappearance settled into formal procedure, the investigation into the Watts family began to shift from concern to suspicion, and from suspicion to structured analysis. What had started as a missing persons case was now being treated with increasing caution by law enforcement, as early inconsistencies in statements and behavior began to accumulate. The house at Saratoga Trail, once a private space of family life, had now become a controlled environment of observation, questioning, and evidence gathering. Christopher Watts remained the only adult present in the home, who could provide direct insight into the last known moments of Shanann and the children. This fact alone placed him at the center of every investigative line of inquiry. Detectives approached him with measured neutrality, asking questions designed not only to gather information, but also to establish behavioral baselines. Where was Shanann when he last saw her? What time did she return home? When did he last see the children? Each question was simple in structure, but the accumulation of answers was what mattered. His responses were consistent in one way: he maintained that he did not know where his family was. He described confusion rather than certainty, absence rather than action. According to his account, Shanann had returned home in the early morning hours and the family had simply vanished afterward. There was no explanation offered that could account for their disappearance. At face value, his story created a scenario that required external cause, an unknown variable that had removed 3 people from a secured residential environment without leaving obvious physical traces. But investigators do not evaluate narratives in isolation. They compare them against physical evidence, digital records, and behavioral patterns. Almost immediately, they began to identify areas where Christopher's account did not align perfectly with other available information. These inconsistencies were not yet definitive proof of wrongdoing, but they were significant enough to deepen scrutiny. One of the first areas of focus was time. Establishing an accurate timeline is essential in any missing persons investigation, especially when multiple individuals are involved. Officers began to reconstruct the sequence of events leading up to Shanann's disappearance by examining phone records, text messages, and communication logs. These digital traces provided a framework that could either support or contradict the statements being given. Shanann's phone activity showed a clear trajectory of communication during her travel home. She had been in contact with friends, sharing updates about her flight and arrival. These messages helped confirm her movements up to a certain point in time. After that, communication stopped. That cessation became a critical reference marker for investigators trying to determine the exact window in which something had occurred. Christopher's phone activity was also examined. His digital footprint revealed patterns that did not fully match the simplicity of his verbal account. There were gaps, delays, and behavioral indicators that suggested more complexity than he was expressing verbally. While digital evidence alone does not establish intent or action, it does provide context that can challenge or reinforce spoken narratives. As detectives continued their assessment inside the home, they began to focus on environmental details. The condition of rooms, the presence or absence of personal items, and the arrangement of everyday objects all contributed to their understanding of whether the house had experienced sudden disruption or remained largely undisturbed. In this case, the environment did not present clear signs of forced entry or struggle, which complicated the emerging picture. The absence of visible disturbance often forces investigators to consider alternative explanations. Voluntary departure becomes one possibility. Domestic conflict becomes another. But when children are involved, especially very young children, the range of plausible explanations narrows significantly. It becomes increasingly difficult to reconcile their absence with scenarios that do not involve external harm or intervention. Christopher's demeanor during questioning also became part of the investigative record. Detectives observed that his emotional responses appeared controlled and measured. He did not display overt panic or visible distress consistent with the disappearance of a spouse and 2 children under unclear circumstances. However, behavioral interpretation is always approached cautiously in investigations, as emotional expression varies widely between individuals. What stood out more significantly were moments of hesitation and subtle inconsistency in his phrasing. Small differences in how events were described, changes in wording, and lack of specificity in certain answers began to form a pattern that investigators noted carefully. These details were not treated as conclusions, but as indicators requiring further verification. Outside the home, additional investigative steps were being taken simultaneously. Friends and family members of Shanann were interviewed to build a clearer picture of her recent activities, emotional state, and relationships. These interviews helped establish that she was engaged in ongoing communication and had no known intention of disappearing voluntarily. Her pregnancy added further urgency to the case, as it significantly reduced the likelihood of voluntary absence. Digital forensic analysis began expanding beyond basic phone records. Social media activity, messaging apps, and location data were all reviewed to construct a more detailed understanding of recent interactions. These tools allowed investigators to identify patterns of communication that would otherwise be invisible in traditional interviews alone. As this broader picture emerged, the initial narrative presented by Christopher Watts began to appear increasingly unstable. It was not that a single contradiction invalidated his account, but rather that multiple small inconsistencies began to accumulate across different sources of information. In investigations, it is often this accumulation that signals the need to shift focus more directly toward a primary subject. At this stage, Christopher was not formally identified as a suspect in the legal sense, but he was becoming the central figure of interest. This distinction is important in investigative procedure. A person of interest is not assumed to be guilty, but is recognized as having proximity and relevance to unresolved questions that require deeper examination. As interviews continued, detectives also began to assess the physical and emotional environment of the household in greater detail. They looked at patterns of daily life, routines, and family structure. Understanding what is normal for a household allows investigators to identify what is not normal when disruption occurs. In the Watts home, the absence of the mother and children stood in stark contrast to the expected rhythm of daily family life. The presence of financial stress and marital strain added additional context. While these factors do not indicate criminal behavior on their own, they are relevant in understanding potential motivations or pressures within a household. Investigators are trained to consider emotional, financial, and relational dynamics as part of a broader situational analysis. As the day progressed, the atmosphere surrounding the investigation shifted noticeably. What had begun as a search for missing individuals was now moving toward a more complex and cautious examination of possible internal involvement. This shift did not happen through a single revelation, but through the gradual convergence of multiple small indicators. Christopher remained cooperative in his interactions, which in itself was not unusual. Many individuals under investigation maintain cooperation even under suspicion. However, cooperation does not eliminate scrutiny. Instead, it becomes one of many factors considered alongside physical evidence and external testimony. By the end of this investigative phase, law enforcement had not yet reached a conclusion about what had happened inside the Watts home, but the direction of the inquiry had clearly changed. The initial assumption of disappearance was no longer sufficient to explain the available information. The case was transitioning into a deeper level of examination, where every detail, every timeline, and every statement would be reevaluated repeatedly. The house at Saratoga Trail, still intact on the outside, had now become the center of an unfolding contradiction. What appeared normal from the street no longer matched what investigators were beginning to uncover inside and around it. And as the investigation continued to expand, that contradiction would only grow more difficult to contain. By the second day of the investigation, the Watts case had reached a turning point that was no longer defined by uncertainty, but by the gradual collapse of a single narrative. What had begun as a missing persons report was now a tightly focused inquiry, shaped by contradictions that were becoming harder to ignore. The structure of the investigation shifted in tone. Questions became more precise. Observations became more critical. And the space between Christopher Watts' account and the emerging evidence began to widen in ways that could no longer be explained by confusion alone. Detectives returned to the Saratoga Trail home with a clearer purpose. The house was no longer just a place where 3 people had disappeared. It was now a potential crime scene, even if the full scope of what had occurred there was still not publicly understood. Every room, every object, and every surface carried potential relevance. What once appeared as ordinary domestic space was now being examined as a layered environment of possible events. Inside, Christopher Watts continued to maintain his original explanation. He repeated that Shanann had returned home in the early morning hours, and that he had no knowledge of her whereabouts after that point. However, repetition does not strengthen credibility in investigative settings. Instead, it often becomes a point of comparison against external data. And by this stage, external data was beginning to tell a different story. One of the most significant developments came from digital forensics. Phone records and messaging activity provided a timeline that placed Shanann's final communications within a narrow and definable window. Her messages indicated that she had arrived home and was in contact with others during her return. After a certain point in the early morning, all communication ceased. That cessation became a critical anchor point for investigators, marking the transition from life as documented activity to unexplained absence. Christopher's digital activity during the same period revealed patterns that were not entirely consistent with his statements. While not immediately conclusive on their own, they contributed to a growing sense that the timeline he had described did not fully align with the objective data being recovered. Investigators are trained to look for overlap between narrative and evidence, and in this case, that overlap was becoming increasingly incomplete. As attention intensified, detectives also began to analyze behavioral responses more closely. Christopher's demeanor during interviews remained calm, but calmness alone is not interpreted as innocence or guilt. Instead, investigators focus on specificity, emotional congruence, and the presence or absence of natural reactions to crisis. In this case, there were moments where his responses appeared structured rather than spontaneous, as if carefully constructed rather than emotionally driven. At the same time, officers revisited the physical layout of the home with renewed focus. They examined entry points, internal movement patterns, and potential locations where evidence might be present. The absence of visible struggle continued to complicate the investigation. There were no clear signs of forced entry, no obvious disruption that would immediately explain how 3 individuals could vanish without trace. However, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Investigators are trained to understand that many crimes, particularly those occurring within domestic environments, do not always produce obvious physical indicators. Instead, they often require interpretation through indirect signs, behavioral inconsistencies, and reconstructed timelines. Outside the home, the case had begun to attract increasing public attention. The idea of an entire family disappearing from a suburban house, without clear explanation, generated widespread concern. Media coverage intensified, and community awareness grew rapidly. People who had previously known the Watts family only in passing were now following developments closely, trying to understand how such a situation could occur in what appeared to be a normal neighborhood. Within investigative circles, however, the focus remained tightly controlled. Law enforcement did not yet publicly declare a suspect, but internally, the direction of the case was becoming more defined. Christopher Watts was now the central figure in nearly every line of inquiry. Not because of assumption, but because of proximity, opportunity, and the accumulation of unresolved inconsistencies. A major turning point occurred during continued questioning sessions. Detectives shifted their approach from general inquiry to more direct confrontation of specific details. These sessions are often designed to test consistency under pressure. When narratives are stable, they remain coherent even when challenged. When they are not, small fractures begin to appear. During these interactions, Christopher's responses began to show increased strain. There were pauses that extended slightly longer than expected. There were moments where phrasing shifted, or where details became less precise. These changes, while subtle, were significant in the context of a developing investigation. At the same time, investigators were also reviewing external testimony from friends and family members of Shanann. These accounts painted a consistent picture of her behavior leading up to the disappearance. She was active, communicative, and engaged in future plans, particularly related to her pregnancy and family life. There was no indication from those closest to her that she intended to leave or withdraw from her life in any voluntary sense. This consistency in external testimony became an important counterpoint to the uncertainty of Christopher's account. When multiple independent sources describe a person as engaged and planning for the future, it becomes increasingly difficult to support explanations based on voluntary disappearance without additional evidence. Financial records and relational history also began to take on greater importance. Investigators examined the structure of the Watts household, including debt levels, spending patterns, and lifestyle pressures. While financial strain alone does not indicate criminal behavior, it can contribute to broader contextual understanding of stress within a household. Combined with evidence of marital tension and extramarital involvement, it added further complexity to the investigative picture. At this stage, the case had entered what investigators often refer to as a narrowing phase. Initial possibilities had been reduced. The range of plausible explanations was shrinking as evidence accumulated. What remained was a more focused set of questions centered around internal dynamics within the household. Christopher Watts was brought in for a formal polygraph examination. This step is not used as definitive proof in legal proceedings, but it is often used as an investigative tool to assess physiological responses under questioning. The purpose is not to determine guilt in isolation, but to evaluate consistency between verbal statements and involuntary physical reactions. The results of this examination became a critical moment in the progression of the case. When confronted with structured questioning under controlled conditions, discrepancies between his statements and physiological responses were identified. This outcome did not immediately establish what had happened, but it significantly altered the trajectory of the investigation. Following the examination, the investigative approach shifted again. The tone became more direct, and the focus narrowed further toward Christopher's actions during the critical time window. Detectives began reconstructing the timeline minute by minute, comparing his statements against digital records, phone activity, and observed behavior. As pressure increased, the stability of the initial narrative began to weaken. Investigators noticed that explanations became less detailed over time, and certain aspects of the timeline were no longer described with the same level of confidence. This gradual erosion of consistency is often a key indicator that an account may not fully align with underlying facts. By the end of this phase, the investigation had reached a point where the original explanation of simple disappearance was no longer considered viable by those leading the case. While no full public disclosure had yet been made, internally the direction of the investigation had shifted decisively. The Watts home, once treated as a site of missing persons inquiry, was now being evaluated as a potential scene of violent crime. Every element of the case, from digital data to behavioral observation, was converging toward a single focal point. And at the center of that focus stood Christopher Watts, whose account no longer matched the accumulating evidence surrounding him. What remained was not uncertainty about whether something serious had happened, but a growing determination to uncover exactly what had occurred inside that house during the final hours before silence replaced a family. By the time the investigation reached the courtroom phase, the narrative surrounding the Watts case had already undergone a complete transformation. What began as a missing persons report had evolved into a criminal case defined not by uncertainty, but by confession, reconstruction, and legal accountability. The transition from investigation to justice was not sudden. It was the result of days of pressure, forensic analysis, and the gradual collapse of denial under the weight of evidence that could no longer be reconciled with the original story. Christopher Watts, once positioned publicly as a grieving husband searching for his family, now stood in a completely different reality. The image of a concerned father speaking to cameras and pleading for information had been replaced by the image of a man in custody, facing charges that carried the most severe consequences under the law. The courtroom became the space where the private reality of what happened inside the Saratoga Trail home would finally be translated into formal legal language. Before the trial itself began, the most significant development had already occurred behind closed doors. Under sustained investigative pressure, and after the polygraph examination, Christopher Watts began to change his account of events. The shift was not immediate or fully transparent at first. It unfolded in stages, each new admission expanding the scope of what investigators believed had happened inside the home on the night of August 13, 2018. Eventually, the narrative that emerged from his own statements confirmed the worst suspicions of the investigative team. Shanann Watts had been killed inside the home. The children had also been killed. These admissions fundamentally altered the nature of the case. It was no longer about disappearance or unknown external factors. It was about internal action, deliberate decisions, and irreversible consequences. Once these admissions were made, the legal process moved rapidly. Formal charges were filed, including multiple counts of first-degree murder, as well as additional charges related to the unlawful handling of human remains and the circumstances surrounding the death of unborn life. The severity of these charges reflected not only the loss of life, but the structure of the actions as they were now understood through confession and evidence. In court proceedings, the focus shifted from discovery to accountability. The role of the prosecution was to establish a coherent and legally supported timeline of events, while the defense navigated the implications of the admissions that had already been made. Unlike the investigative phase, where uncertainty allows for multiple interpretations, the courtroom demands structure, clarity, and legal precision. The prosecution presented the case in a way that emphasized sequence and intent. They outlined the timeline of Shanann's return home, the events that followed inside the residence, and the subsequent actions taken to conceal what had occurred. Each stage was carefully reconstructed using a combination of forensic evidence, digital records, and the defendant's own statements. The goal was not only to show what happened, but to demonstrate how each action logically followed the previous one within a continuous chain of events. Christopher Watts' own admissions played a central role in this reconstruction. His statements provided internal confirmation of events that otherwise would have required extensive inference. In legal terms, a confession is not simply another piece of evidence. It is a foundational element that can shape the entire structure of a case. However, even confessions are examined within context, and their alignment with physical and digital evidence is critical in determining their reliability. The courtroom atmosphere during these proceedings was defined by restraint rather than spectacle. Unlike the chaotic emotional energy often associated with criminal trials in media portrayals, the reality was procedural, methodical, and focused on establishing factual clarity. The gravity of the case was present not through dramatic expression, but through the content of what was being described. Shanann Watts, Bella Watts, and Celeste Watts were no longer missing persons. In legal terms, they were victims of homicide. This shift in classification is significant because it marks the transition from search to accountability. Once a case reaches this stage, the objective is no longer to locate individuals, but to formally establish responsibility for their deaths under the law. The defense, operating within the constraints of the admissions already made, had limited space to construct alternative interpretations. In cases where confession is present, the legal strategy often shifts toward explaining circumstances rather than disputing core events. This distinction is important in understanding how justice systems process cases where the facts of the act are no longer in dispute, but questions remain about motivation, mental state, and legal classification. Throughout the proceedings, the timeline remained central. The court examined the sequence of events with precision, focusing on time stamps, communication records, and forensic findings that aligned with the defendant's own account. This alignment between confession and evidence strengthened the prosecution's position, reducing ambiguity about what had occurred inside the home. The emotional weight of the case was present in the courtroom, even when not explicitly expressed. The absence of Shanann and her two daughters was not only a factual reality, but also a psychological presence that influenced the perception of the proceedings. Their lives, their final moments, and their absence formed the silent backdrop against which legal arguments were made. Eventually, the case moved toward resolution through a plea agreement. Christopher Watts entered formal guilty pleas to multiple charges, acknowledging responsibility for the deaths that had occurred inside the home. This decision eliminated the need for a full jury trial, instead allowing the court to proceed directly to sentencing based on established facts and admissions. The sentencing phase of the case carried its own procedural gravity. The court's responsibility at this stage was not to determine guilt, as that had already been established through plea, but to determine the legal consequences of that guilt. In doing so, the court considered the nature of the crimes, the vulnerability of the victims, and the circumstances under which the offenses occurred. Statements from family members and those affected by the loss were presented during this phase. These statements provided emotional context to the legal proceedings, articulating the impact of the events beyond the boundaries of law and evidence. While the court operates within a legal framework, it also acknowledges the human consequences that extend beyond procedural outcomes. Ultimately, the sentence imposed reflected the severity of the crimes and the legal standards governing such cases. Multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole were issued, ensuring that the defendant would remain incarcerated for the remainder of his life. Additional penalties were applied in accordance with the specific charges related to each victim. From a legal perspective, this outcome represented closure in terms of adjudication. The system had processed the evidence, evaluated the admissions, and delivered a formal conclusion. However, justice in a legal sense does not equate to emotional resolution for those affected. The families, friends, and community members connected to the victims continued to live with the absence that the legal process could acknowledge, but not reverse. The courtroom phase of the Watts case therefore stands as the point at which private tragedy became public record. Every detail that had once been hidden inside a suburban home was now documented, analyzed, and preserved within legal archives. The transformation from silence to structured accountability marked the end of one phase of the case, but not the end of its emotional impact. What remained after the courtroom proceedings was not uncertainty about responsibility, but the lasting reality of what had been lost. The legal system had spoken, but the absence created by the events inside that house could not be resolved through verdict alone. After the courtroom doors closed and the formal language of law had completed its function, what remained in the Watts case was not resolution in the emotional sense, but a long and difficult aftermath that extended far beyond the boundaries of the investigation and trial. The legal system had reached its conclusion, but the human consequences continued to unfold in quieter, more enduring ways. The absence created by the events of August 13, 2018, did not diminish with time or legal finality. Instead, it became a permanent condition for those connected to the victims. In Frederick, Colorado, the house at Saratoga Trail remained physically unchanged for a period of time after the case concluded. From the outside, it still looked like a suburban family home, structured and intact, part of a neighborhood that continued its daily rhythm. Cars still passed on nearby streets. Neighbors still maintained their routines. But for those who understood its history, the house carried a weight that was no longer visible but deeply felt. It was no longer simply a residence. It had become a point of reference for loss that could not be visually represented. For Sharnan Watts' family, the aftermath was defined by absence in its most absolute form. There were no new messages, no future milestones, no evolving relationship that could continue forward in time. Instead, there was only memory and reconstruction. They were left to piece together fragments of her life, not as it ended, but as it had been lived. Photos, videos, text messages, and recordings became the primary means through which her presence could still be accessed. Each piece of digital memory carried emotional weight, not because it was rare, but because it was finite. The experience of grief in this case was not static. It evolved as new information emerged during the investigation and trial. Learning the details of what had happened inside the home added a layer of complexity that many families never have to confront. There is grief that comes from loss, and there is grief that is shaped by knowledge of how that loss occurred. In this case, those two forms of grief became inseparable. For the extended family, the presence of Bella and Celeste in memory was particularly powerful. Their lives were short, but deeply documented. Videos captured their voices, their laughter, and their interactions with the world around them. These recordings became both a source of comfort and a source of pain. They preserved identity, but they also preserved finality. There was no future evolution of their personalities, no continuation of growth. What existed was complete, yet permanently unfinished. In the wider community, the aftermath took on a different form. There was collective disbelief that such an event could occur within a seemingly ordinary suburban environment. People who lived nearby were forced to reassess their assumptions about visibility and safety. The Watts case disrupted the idea that external normality always reflects internal stability. It introduced a lasting awareness that serious violence can exist behind surfaces that appear entirely ordinary. Media coverage of the case extended the reach of its impact far beyond Colorado. Documentaries, interviews, and analytical programs examined the timeline, the psychology, and the investigative process in detail. The case became widely known not only for the tragedy itself, but for the contrast between the outward appearance of the family and the reality that was later uncovered. This contrast became a central theme in public discussion, often cited as an example of how perception and reality can diverge within domestic environments. Over time, the narrative of the Watts family became part of a broader cultural conversation about hidden dysfunction in families and the limits of external observation. People began to reflect on how easily internal struggles can remain invisible to neighbors, friends, and even extended family. The case challenged assumptions about what warning signs look like and whether they are always recognizable before it is too late. For those directly involved in the investigation, the aftermath also carried its own weight. Law enforcement officers who worked on the case were left with the psychological residue that often accompanies cases involving family violence. While procedural closure is achieved through resolution and conviction, the memory of the details does not simply disappear. Cases involving children, in particular, leave lasting impressions that extend beyond professional responsibility. Christopher Watts, now serving multiple life sentences, exists in a very different reality from the one he inhabited before the events. The legal outcome removed him permanently from society, but it did not remove the case from public consciousness. His actions continue to be analyzed, discussed, and examined in various contexts, particularly in discussions around criminal psychology, relational breakdown, and behavioral escalation. However, within the broader understanding of the aftermath, his presence is secondary to the absence of those he killed. The focus of reflection remains on Sean Ann, Bella, and Celeste, whose lives were interrupted in a way that reshaped multiple lives around them. Their absence is not defined by the perpetrator, but by the lives they lived before the crime occurred. One of the most enduring aspects of the aftermath is the way time interacts with memory. As years pass, public attention may shift, but for those directly affected, time does not reduce the presence of loss. Instead, it changes its form. What was once immediate shock becomes long-term remembrance. What was once active investigation becomes historical record. Yet the emotional core remains unchanged. The Watts case also influenced how similar investigations are approached in some contexts. It reinforced the importance of early behavioral analysis, digital evidence collection, and the careful examination of inconsistencies in missing persons reports. While no single case can define investigative practice, high-profile cases often contribute to procedural awareness and training discussions within law enforcement communities. In the digital space, the case continues to exist as a subject of ongoing discussion. Online communities revisit timelines, analyze statements, and attempt to reconstruct events with increasing detail. This sustained interest reflects a broader human tendency to seek coherence in events that are fundamentally difficult to emotionally process. The need to understand does not diminish with time, even when legal resolution has already been achieved. Yet beneath all of this analysis, documentation, and discussion, the central reality remains unchanged. A mother and 2 young children lost their lives inside a home that once represented ordinary family life. That fact cannot be altered by explanation, interpretation, or time. It remains fixed as the core truth around which all other narratives are built. The aftermath of the Watts family case, therefore, is not a conclusion but a continuing state of reflection. It exists in memory, in legal record, in cultural discussion, and in the private lives of those who were closest to the victims. It is defined not by what was resolved, but by what can never be restored. And in that sense, the story does not truly end with the courtroom or the sentencing. It continues in the silence that follows, where questions no longer seek legal answers, but instead remain as part of a permanent emotional landscape shaped by absence. What remains after a case like the Watts family murders is not simply a record of events, but a fracture in the way people understand familiarity, trust, and the hidden architecture of ordinary life. Even after convictions, confessions, and sentencing, the case continues to echo because it challenges something fundamental in human perception, the belief that proximity equals understanding. The Watts family lived in a space that looked entirely ordinary, and yet within that ordinariness unfolded something that permanently altered how many people view domestic life itself. At the center of that lasting impact is the contradiction between appearance and reality. The Watts home did not exist in isolation from society. It was part of a neighborhood, part of a community, part of a network of everyday interactions that seemed stable and predictable. Neighbors exchanged greetings, children played nearby, and daily routines continued uninterrupted. That normality is what makes the aftermath so difficult to process. It forces the realization that external structure offers no absolute guarantee of internal stability. The psychological weight of the case extends beyond the individuals directly involved. It has become a reference point in discussions about hidden dysfunction, emotional distance, and the limitations of external observation. People often return to it not because of curiosity alone, but because it disrupts assumptions about how life signals danger. There were no clear external warnings visible to the community before the tragedy unfolded. That absence of visible indicators is what continues to unsettle those who study or reflect on the case. Within families and relationships more broadly, the case is often discussed in terms of emotional invisibility. Not because every strained relationship leads to violence, but because emotional disconnection can exist without obvious external expression. In the Watts case, the gradual widening of emotional distance inside the home was not clearly visible to those outside it. This creates a difficult tension in understanding how much of human life is accessible to outside perception, and how much remains permanently internal. Another layer of the case's lasting significance lies in the role of digital life. Shanann Watts' extensive use of social media created a documented version of family life that appeared cohesive and positive. This digital record now exists alongside the investigative findings, creating a contrast between curated representation and internal reality. That contrast has become part of broader conversations about how online presence can shape perception of personal stability. It is not that the digital representation was false in every moment, but that it represented only selected fragments of a much more complex reality. The presence of children in the case adds an additional dimension that continues to affect public interpretation. Bella and Celeste were not simply part of the narrative, they were central to its emotional impact. Their ages, their dependence, and their documented presence in everyday family life contribute to why the case remains so deeply affecting. Childhood represents continuity and future possibility, and when that continuity is abruptly removed, the sense of loss extends beyond immediate family to a wider emotional audience. Over time, the case has also become part of a broader pattern of public fascination with domestic violence cases that occur within seemingly normal environments. This fascination is not purely sensational. It often stems from an attempt to understand how such events can remain invisible until they reach a point of irreversible consequence. The Watts case is frequently analyzed in this context, because it does not present the kinds of external warning signs that people are often taught to recognize. However, one of the most important lessons that emerges from long-term reflection on the case is the limitation of hindsight. After the full timeline is known, it becomes tempting to reconstruct meaning from fragments that were not originally connected. Behavioral cues, communication patterns, and emotional shifts can appear more significant in retrospect than they were at the time. This retrospective clarity is part of human cognition, but it does not always translate into predictive certainty in real-life situations. In the legal sense, the case concluded with finality. The judicial system processed the evidence, evaluated the admissions, and issued sentences that reflect the severity of the crimes. But legal closure does not equate to emotional closure. The distinction between those two forms of resolution is particularly evident in cases involving family loss. Law provides structure and consequence, but it cannot restore absence or reverse time. For those studying criminal behavior, the Watts case is often discussed in terms of relational breakdown, decision escalation, and psychological compartmentalization. The actions that occurred did not arise in a vacuum. They developed within a framework of personal relationships, emotional detachment, and escalating internal conflict. Understanding that progression is part of broader efforts to study how extreme outcomes can emerge from ordinary environments without clear external warning. Yet even with analysis, there remains a limit to comprehension. Some aspects of human behavior resist complete explanation. The transition from internal conflict to irreversible action is not always fully accessible through external evidence alone. Investigations can reconstruct sequence and establish fact, but they cannot fully reconstruct subjective experience in its entirety. That gap between fact and internal state is where uncertainty persists. The Watts case also continues to influence media representation of true crime narratives. Documentaries and analytical programs revisit the timeline, the investigation, and the psychological dimensions of the case. Each retelling adds another layer of interpretation, but none can alter the underlying reality of what occurred. Over time, these retellings become less about discovery and more about reflection, as audiences engage with the case not for new information, but for understanding. Within families who experience similar forms of loss, cases like this often carry a different kind of resonance. They are not viewed as narratives for consumption, but as reminders of fragility within human relationships. The permanence of absence becomes the defining feature, overshadowing the investigative and legal dimensions that dominate public discussion. In Frederick, Colorado, life continues in the same physical space where the events once occurred. Time moves forward, neighborhoods change gradually, and new families build their lives in the same environment. But for those who are aware of the history, the location carries a memory that is not visible, but remains present in awareness. It is not a memory that disrupts daily life, but one that exists beneath it as part of a broader understanding of what has taken place there. Ultimately, the Watts family case remains significant not because it can be fully explained, but because it cannot be fully reconciled with expectations of normal life. It sits at the intersection of familiarity and rupture, showing how quickly one can become the other without external warning. That tension is what continues to draw attention years after the events themselves. The story does not offer resolution in the traditional sense. It offers documentation, reflection, and a permanent record of loss that cannot be reversed. In that record, the names Shanann, Bella, and Celeste remain central, not as symbols of a case, but as individuals whose lives existed in full before they were interrupted. And it is that human reality, more than any investigative detail or legal outcome, that defines the lasting impact of everything that followed. In the years following the conclusion of the Watts case, the story did not fade into obscurity the way many criminal cases eventually do. Instead, it remained in circulation, continuously reinterpreted through documentaries, podcasts, investigative analysis, and public discussion. What changed over time was not the facts themselves, but the way those facts were framed, examined, and emotionally processed by those who encountered them. The case became less about discovery and more about interpretation, less about what happened and more about why it continues to matter. As time passed, the Watts family home at Saratoga Trail transitioned from a crime scene into a symbolic space within public memory. Physical ownership eventually changed, and the house ceased to function as a preserved investigative site. Yet even after its physical presence in the case diminished, its psychological presence remained. For many people familiar with the story, the address itself became shorthand for a broader reflection on hidden violence within domestic environments. It represented not just a location, but a rupture in the expectation that home is inherently safe. One of the most persistent elements of the case's ongoing discussion is the contrast between visibility and invisibility. Before August 2018, the Watts family appeared to exist within the boundaries of ordinary suburban life. There were social media posts, family photographs, work routines, and interactions with friends and neighbors. These external indicators created a coherent image of stability. Yet within that same structure, internal dynamics were shifting in ways that were not externally visible. That disconnect between appearance and reality continues to be one of the most examined aspects of the case. In broader cultural conversations, the Watts case is often referenced when discussing the limitations of perception in understanding personal relationships. It challenges the assumption that outward presentation reliably reflects internal conditions. However, it is also important to recognize that this does not imply that hidden danger is always present in ordinary settings. Rather, it highlights the complexity of human behavior and the fact that internal emotional states are not always directly observable from the outside. The case has also had a lasting influence on how people engage with digital footprints. Shanann Watts' extensive documentation of family life through social media created a permanent record that now exists alongside investigative findings. This has led to ongoing discussions about how curated online representations can coexist with private emotional realities. The existence of both narratives side by side does not negate either one, but it does highlight how incomplete any single perspective can be when trying to understand a full human life. For those studying criminal psychology, the Watts case is often analyzed in terms of behavioral progression rather than sudden transformation. The focus is placed on how emotional detachment, relational strain, and external influences can interact over time within a domestic environment. This approach emphasizes gradual change rather than abrupt shift, although it does not always provide definitive explanations for final actions. Human behavior, particularly in extreme cases, often resists full categorization even within structured analysis. Another dimension that continues to be discussed is the role of communication breakdown within relationships. In many domestic environments, emotional distance does not manifest as clear or immediate separation. Instead, it can develop through subtle reductions in communication quality, frequency, and emotional transparency. In the Watts case, retrospective analysis often highlights these gradual shifts, though it is important to note that such observations are made with the advantage of knowing the outcome. At the time, these signals were not interpreted as indicators of imminent crisis by those outside the immediate relationship. Public engagement with the case has also evolved into a form of collective examination. Online communities revisit timelines, analyze statements, and debate interpretations of events. This ongoing engagement reflects a broader human tendency to seek coherence in situations that are emotionally difficult to fully process. The desire to understand does not necessarily diminish over time, even when legal processes have concluded. Instead, it often shifts into analytical and reflective forms. However, within this sustained attention, there is also a growing awareness of ethical boundaries in discussing real-life tragedies. The Watts case involves the loss of real individuals whose lives extended far beyond the moment of their deaths. As such, responsible engagement with the case requires balancing analytical interest with recognition of human dignity. This includes acknowledging that behind every detail of investigation and analysis were people with relationships, emotions, and lived experiences that cannot be reduced to narrative structure alone. In the legal system, the case is closed. The sentences have been imposed, the confessions recorded, and the evidentiary process completed. From a procedural standpoint, there is no further action required. Yet legal closure exists in a different space from emotional or societal processing. The latter continues to evolve as long as the case remains part of public consciousness. This distinction is important in understanding why certain cases continue to be discussed long after their formal conclusion. The Watts case also contributes to ongoing discussions about how domestic violence and familicide are understood in contemporary society. It reinforces the idea that such events do not always emerge from easily identifiable external patterns. Instead, they can develop within environments that appear externally stable. This does not mean that prevention is impossible, but it does highlight the challenges involved in identifying risk when warning signs are not clearly visible or are interpreted differently by those within the relationship. At the same time, it is crucial to avoid reducing the case to a simplified lesson or single explanation. Human behavior in extreme circumstances is influenced by multiple interacting factors, including psychological state, relational dynamics, and situational pressures. While analysis can identify contributing elements, it cannot fully reconstruct subjective internal experience. There remains an irreducible complexity to decisions that result in irreversible outcomes. Over time, the emotional resonance of the case has shifted. For some, it remains a subject of analytical interest. For others, it serves as a reminder of the fragility of trust and communication within intimate relationships. For those directly affected by the loss, it is a permanent absence that does not diminish with public discussion or time. These different layers of response coexist without replacing one another. The Watts case ultimately occupies a space between understanding and incomprehension. It can be documented, analyzed, and legally resolved, but it cannot be fully emotionally resolved in a universal sense. The presence of unanswered psychological and relational questions ensures that it continues to be revisited, not because new facts emerge, but because the existing facts continue to raise questions about human behavior and perception. In the end, what remains most significant is not the structure of the case itself, but the lives that existed before it. Sharnan Watts, Bella Watts, and Celeste Watts are remembered not only through the circumstances of their deaths, but through the reality of their lives as they were lived. Their presence in memory persists beyond investigation, beyond analysis, and beyond narrative interpretation. And it is within that persistence that the case continues to hold meaning, not as a closed event in time, but as an ongoing reflection on how closely ordinary life and irreversible rupture can exist within the same space without warning.